This public hearing of the Trade Subcommittee of the Joint Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade for the inquiry into strengthening Australia's trade and investment relations with Africa. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today. I would also like to pay my respects to elders past and present. I also acknowledge the cultures of any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people present with us today. This hearing will be broadcast on the Parliament's website, and the proof and official transcripts of the proceedings will be published on the committee's webpage. I now welcome representatives from Austrade to give evidence today. For the Hansard record, would you please state your name and the capacity in which you appear before the committee?
Mr J. Meek, General Manager, Trade Diversification Task Force.
Mr Jason Versby, General Manager, Trade.
Thank you. This hearing is a legal proceeding of the Parliament. The giving of false or misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as a contempt of Parliament. The evidence given today will be recorded by Hansard and attracts parliamentary privilege. I now invite you to make a brief opening statement before we proceed to questions.
So, Chair, we don't actually have an opening statement. This is our second time here. Okay.
Okay, that's good. That's all fine. I might just start with just a very general question. If you could just provide us with an overview of current trade and investment with Africa, including the key markets targeted by Australian businesses, and then also what are the key factors behind Australia's current low level of trade and investment with Africa?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I think, as probably some of your other presenters to this inquiry have indicated, there's about $12.7 billion of two-way trade between Australia and the African continent, and I think it's important to distinguish the continent between countries within Africa along that, and that's in 2024. There's about 3,000 Australian businesses that are actually exporting goods to the African countries along the way. Admittedly, though, that is very much skewed to a very limited number that move the most volume and value of those products into the continent. It's very much probably made up of, in terms of sectoral focus, the resources sector is very dominant. There's over 100 ASX-listed junior miners operating in the African continent that cover over about 30-odd countries. And with that comes a supply chain commonly known as the METS, or the mining, equipment, technology and services sector that supply into that. We also see agri-food, or specifically wheat, as a food source going in from Australia to certain countries. And we also obviously export our education services as a third sort of key area. You also asked about challenges, and I think there's probably one core challenge is actually the modes of transport, of actually the ability for us to move goods and services, or particularly goods, into countries within Africa. We have limited shipping routes that provide containerised services. There are obviously bulk services.
I'll just hand over to Deputy Chair for
keep talking and I'll keep listening.
Yep. Obviously the limited amount of logistics to move goods to Africa, or the ability to move goods within Africa remains a challenge. Second is obviously the knowledge of opportunities within countries within the African continent remain a challenge for Australian businesses, particularly when they have alternate regions and markets comparably to look at, like Southeast Asia or our latest trading partner, China. And when you couple that with obviously the GDP in some of these countries, there is actually limited opportunity within that. That said, is that there are lots of changes that are happening across Africa, and actually taking a view over the horizon about how we might want to explore those, and whether that be infrastructure related, food security related, education related, and building on our globally known resources sector are as opportunities that could certainly be explored. So, Deputy Chair, I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, okay. Look, I might just expand on that. As an organisation, have you made any recent changes to your presence in the region, in Africa? And I'm just reflecting on some hearings we had last Friday where I think Egypt might have said you've closed. I'm not sure what this.
Yeah, so over the years, is that our presence in Africa has ebbed and flowed. Yeah. And obviously, as an agency, that we need to make decisions about where we have a footprint globally. Currently, we have operations in Kenya with 2 locally engaged staff and a trade commissioner, and a 3rd additional resource coming on board in, I think, about June this year. We also have a presence in Ghana with 2 locally engaged staff, and the Kenyan side, Kenyan operation, which looks after East Africa, is managed by our Middle Eastern operation, and as well as the Ghanaian side. And we also have historically had a presence in Morocco, and there's currently a vacant locally engaged role. Historically, we did have a presence in South Africa, and I think it was in 2023 that we closed that office and relocated that office to relocated the Trade Commissioner role to Kenya. But like always, that as an agency, that we look at our international network on a regular basis, and where we think we need to have those resources, and we'll continue to do that, and Africa would obviously be considered in that mix.
So the Moroccan position still exists but is currently vacant, and it's a locally engaged position.
So, Deputy Chair, maybe to sort of highlight, it's actually incredibly important to have locally engaged staff.
No, it wasn't a criticism. Yeah. I just was wanting to clarify. Concern was raised from the Moroccan side last Friday when we met with respect to that. So are efforts underway to recruit for that position?
So so that region is managed out of our general manager is based in Paris, and we actually have someone as an interim that is Moroccan speaking out of Paris that's providing some services whilst we recruit and consider that role in that market.
Okay, so just go back. Historically, you said South Africa, and where was the other?
So over the course of the last 15 years, most of the presence has been in Kenya, Ghana and South Africa. And if you were to look at the continent, that breaks out the west region with Ghana, east with Kenya, and the southern parts with South Africa. And we made a decision in 2003 to close down the South African operation and move the Trade Commissioner role to Kenya because of, frankly, growth opportunities that are existing in East Africa.
Okay. So what's the process that you go through to assess those trade opportunities? And of course, so we're exposing ourselves to that various countries through this process, and I suppose we ourselves are making some of those sorts of assessments as we go through those interactions. What's the process that you look at in that sense? Is it what is your process?
So I might start, and I'll hand over to Mr. Versby briefly, is that we go through regular reviews of our international network, obviously with what our budget is, and looking at government priorities and where we need to have a presence that aligns to opportunity. But what we also look at is the data of what exporters are doing and where we have a role into play into making that decision. So looking at the countries in the African continent, there are 54 countries there that we would need to think carefully about where our presence is located to be able to actually make a difference for Australian exporters. And we would need to consider our presence in Africa in relation to other regions and countries. And for example, countries where we see more businesses wanting to do exporting will proportionally have higher resources, and we'll factor that all in. But if I could hand to Mr. Bursby.
We're obviously looking at also the economic opportunity in particular markets and factors.
That's where I was going to go,
Yep.
because, I mean, part of what you do is matching.
Yep.
And if somebody here has something that they're looking to place into a market, the opportunities in those various markets is a potential match.
As Mr. Meek said at the start, the exporter and the merchandise side to Africa is quite concentrated in 100 companies would make up 99% of the total sort of exports to the region. So we know on the merchandise side where they're looking and the markets that they're seeking assistance in. There's around 160 clients that we've assisted over a 12-month period on average over the last couple of years in the Africa region. To put that in context, we're assisting around 6,000 clients globally, or exporters globally, with their expansion plans. So we look at it in the context of that global footprint. Increasingly as well, we have the Go Global Toolkit, which is our online service where we have country profiles, and looking at what is the demand for those, also in the context of how does that look on a global scale as well in terms of where companies are looking for information.
And if I could also add is that I referenced that Kenya and Ghana report into our Middle East operations and noting the current challenges in the region, but historically a lot of business people from the eastern part of Africa will travel up into the Middle East to events like Gulf Foods, where our Australian food industry is presented and displayed, and they will use that as a platform to do business. So whilst it may not always be a direct one-on-one in market for service for that opportunity, we will obviously leverage some of these large trade shows to bring people in.
So are there particular some countries are moving more quickly than others, and some are developing quite quickly, and some are at different levels of business type. Do we look at those jurisdictions and utilise our network to make Australian business aware of particular opportunities?
So there's a couple of ways that we're engaging with business. Primary through the Go Global Toolkit is where we're publishing those opportunities in Africa, but also holding live events or webinars that we promote through peak bodies and through states and territory governments to try and engage businesses in attending those events to make them aware of where the Africa market is, what the conditions are, where we're seeing opportunities. The other thing we're doing is on the education side, where it's the 5th largest region in terms of students into Australia, but still relatively modest at 19,000 and 2.5%, is engaging with the agents as well on the ground in Africa to make them aware of the Australian opportunity, because 70% of students come through that channel in terms of attending at Australian universities as well.
And more recently, under the Accessing New Market initiative, is that we've actually partnered with the Australian African Chamber of Commerce here in Australia to build roadmaps in East Africa on agri opportunities or agri-food opportunities, and we're building those roadmaps with that chamber And our intention is to then run a series of webinars and engage with Australian businesses so that they understand that opportunity.
Okay.
Sorry.
Just with respect to education, what conversations are you having with Australian institutions with respect to providing service in country rather than bringing people here? I mean, we are
transnational education.
Sorry?
Sorry to interrupt.
Well, I mean, so I was going to say both vocational and tertiary, but we're feeling here the pressures of international education coming into the country and that contributing to a whole range of other local issues. But the opportunity to use our excellent educational frameworks, toolkits, curriculums, all of those sorts of things in a collaborative sense in other jurisdictions, and my sense is that they would be open to that. What work are we doing in that sense? Because I think that's, talking to the ambassadors, that's something that they would certainly very much welcome and where I think we could play a significant role.
So there's two elements to the strategy on education. There's obviously study in Australia and then study with Australia, which is the transnational education. Curtin University has established a campus in Mauritius, and
yes,
they are in the sort of top 5 providers, I guess, in the African market. But increasingly, there's also campuses in the Middle East. So there's 3 that are situated in Dubai: Curtin, Murdoch, and University of Wollongong. The University of Wollongong are also looking at opening a campus in Saudi Arabia. So part of the strategy is also to attract African students into those campuses, and that increasingly is part of the strategy that we're executing in terms of our international education remit.
It's certainly something that was put to us last week, that in some jurisdictions, in particular, they saw opportunity in that sense. What are the hurdles from our perspective that we're seeing in relation to developing that market?
So obviously there's only those campuses that are open, and there's still can be high cost markets in the Middle East for people to study in. So you're still attracting people into those markets. Obviously from a regulatory perspective as well, the actual partnerships with institutions in Africa, there's more work to be done there in terms of forming partnerships between our institutions and them to share curricula. We are doing some admissions with education providers into the region. We had in the last couple of years, we had 20 go there, which was very much focused on that transnational opportunity and forming relationships with providers on the ground in Africa.
In terms of government to government, and I'll make this my last question, Chair, so others can have a bit of a crack. In terms of government to government conversations, is there anything active happening there? I mean, this is an enormous opportunity, I think, for us to, in both a trade sense but a developmental assistance sense, for us to make a real contribution, and one that over time will translate into a whole range of other things because of the relationships built.
I might just go to the first part and then hand to you, Mr. Bursby, is that just as a bit of background, I've been operating in Africa for 25 years. I've been posted over there, and education's been on the agenda for that whole time.
Yeah.
And there's been extensive amount of work between students coming in and the competition globally between the US, Canada and the UK
yes,
in taking those students. But there is an evolving conversation where you can see in the world today is that where people will be educated will be different. And so that is a window of opportunity to start talking about what could happen. But what it needs to be considered is that our education providers are businesses for a broader sense, and they have a sequence of priority markets, and it's how we position to them what opportunities exist in Africa compared to somewhere like India, Malaysia or other countries that they would then need to consider, is that a priority? So I think from a government perspective we can have the conversation, and then it's about those institutions of weighing up that opportunity to be viable for them to invest.
So it's probably worth also just touching on some examples in that transnational space. So Edith Cowan University with Strathmore University in Kenya have signed an agreement, Curtin University as well, with the University of Nairobi. And we've also formed a partnership. There's been an MOU between Curtin and Murdoch universities with Guinea's Ministry of Planning and International Cooperation around student flows, and they're going into Murdoch University as well as the University of New South Wales and UWA with the Ghana government. I think there's, as you point out, more opportunity to do more in that space, and once we get those institutional links created, obviously that creates opportunities in terms of student flow as well.
Not one of those that you've mentioned are vocational though.
Not vocational,
and in that sense, governmental relationship, I think, is critical to actually facilitating that. And so that's why I place the emphasis that I do on government relationships, because it will be the government-to-government work that will actually support the vocational element, because it is different and regarded differently, and according to some of the evidence we received last week, even costed differently based on government support or otherwise in delivering those services. But there is no less demand for those services, in fact probably more. Okay, seems like that's a statement.
Yep.
Thanks.
Okay, so can I just talk about Canada and understand it announced its first global Africa strategy, and it has quite a larger footprint. If you could comment on that, and if in your view Australia would benefit from a similar strategy.
So to be honest, I don't know all of the detail of the Canada strategy, and I can't really comment on detail on that today, but historically Canada's had a reasonably strong presence in the African continent through its Trade Commission network and equivalent, and playing a very similar role to some of the things that we're doing. I think it is probably worth noting through some of the Accessing New Markets initiative work that we're doing at the moment around diversification, Austrade's looking at two key things. As I mentioned previously here today, is that we're running at some sectoral work to provide opportunity back to business, but we are also looking through what's known as a trade diversification network of peak bodies, is to bring a gathering together of those peak bodies and key businesses to start exploring the opportunities that exist in Africa that might shape what a strategy might look like. And that will obviously look at what sectors, what countries that we could look at, and could take in, the elements of education that might underpin that. That strategy would need to be considered over time about what could be achieved now, and I think it's timely to have these conversations then to work out what we're choosing to focus on that might influence our resourcing or the efforts that we do on countries within Africa.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Mr Newman, did you? Or...
Yeah, we've got looks like about 9 posts or something across Africa, and then we've got a number of honorary consulates across Africa, and they're all sort of lumped in together. Is there, and where we haven't got a, for example, in Uganda we've got an honorary consulate, whereas we've got, in Kenya we've got, a high commission. So I'm just wondering, why have we got such a small footprint across Africa, and does that impede your work? For example, Chair asked you a question about Canada. It's a long way from Africa, and I say this as a Queenslander, which faces, the Pacific. Western Australia faces the Indian Ocean towards Africa. Yeah. We don't seem to have much, and I mean, this is a bit of political will, But ought we not to convert a lot of these honorary consulate situations, in, for example, Botswana, Uganda, etc., into posts, full-time official posts? Would that help your prospects of the work you do?
Can I answer the question in two parts? So you're referring to the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trades network, and actually prior to you coming here, I just outlined where our footprint is, which is primarily focused on Kenya, Ghana and Morocco are the three locations where we have had staff and operate staff within. I actually think, so the answer is, for me, is have the strategy first and look at your resourcing. And that's born out of personal experience of operating in the continent, is that out of 54 countries, you need to be very clear at what you're running at and the resources that you need to help deliver that. And that's possibly where you're leading to with your comment around the Canadian strategy, is that they will be laser focused on areas of opportunity. And that's principally the way that I think Austrade needs to consider. So to answer your question, yes, if additional resourcing is appropriate, but it needs to be aligned to a strategy, and it needs a business community from a trade and investment to have buy-in to that strategy to help execute it. And if I could give you a practical example, is that you'll hear about the resources sector and you'll hear about METS, or mining equipment and technology services, a lot in Africa, is that we have a really clear approach to countries where we do mining, and we have a supply chain that backs into that. It's about thinking broader and about what other sectors might be able to come in and support that. But we've got to be clear on what we're doing with the strategy first.
And I think it's very important that we're focused at the moment on raising the awareness of the opportunities in Africa, because if you look across those 54 countries, there's probably only a dozen that have more than 100 exporters engaged, and it's very more than 95% is in those top 100 in terms of total exports as well. So there's a lot of work to be done in terms of educating, or not educating, but making the business community aware of where those opportunities are, which is linked to the Go Global Toolkit and the work we're doing through the Trade Diversification Network.
And to what extent do you leverage our connections? For example, there's a great disproportion between our trade with South Africa compared to most of the rest of the continent. Yet in South Africa, we have a lot of synergies in terms of sport, and which was a great way to enhance, whether it's netball, cricket, football, rugby. Bringing executives from mining companies, bringing people there, connecting with one another. To what extent do you leverage those opportunities?
So historically, we've done very much that. As when I was posted in
I
Johannesburg,
was smiling sagaciously when I was asking those.
Leveraging the Wallabies coming into South Africa, leveraging the cricket team does bring executives together. But at the end of the day, it's about business translating to deal flow. What I do find is that we probably currently have a better approach with key events in market, where we can bring those executives together. So in the resources sector, how do we bring those people into one location where business can happen, which will take time. We've seen major food events will start in Kenya next year that will bring the food industry from around the world looking at East African opportunities. So yes, we can leverage those things, but there's also other opportunities through those trade events and delegations that we can leverage as well. We do that every day. The
other point that we touched briefly on earlier was around attracting African businesses into events in the Middle East as well. So Gulf Food, a lot of the buyers come to that event in Dubai. The Future Minerals Forum in Saudi Arabia as well also tracks a lot of the resources sector from Africa, which presents opportunities for our METS companies to engage with them.
We just had the African Football Cup, which was huge.
Yeah.
Absolutely, totally dominated sports and media across Africa and into Europe and Australia. But to what extent did we do anything in relation to getting people to that event? They're the sort of things I think we don't. Malawi is fantastic at netball. They are so proud of their netball competition. Do we leverage that? I'm just wanting to know. It's not just about South Africa. It's about all these other countries. Morocco made the World Cup in football. There's a whole bunch of opportunities that I think that we need to think about.
Great.
Do you agree?
Yeah, there's obviously opportunity in sport diplomacy, particularly in the lead up to the Brisbane Olympics. It's something that, as an agency, we're actively focused on how we use that. The Rugby World Cup in 27, there'll be African countries that are participating in that. How do we bring the business to occur at those events?
And if I could give you a little bit of history, is that in the Commonwealth Games in Melbourne, we brought 275 business leaders from Africa over to the Commonwealth Games in a business club arrangement that actually allowed that to happen. So this does happen over time, and it obviously depends on the engagement on both sides to make it happen.
Thanks very much.
Okay, we'll go to Ms Cludrum and then to Senator Smith, and then to,
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair. I just had a question about Austrade's investment in language. So whether there's a strategy or a program to develop skills in Australians who might be working in government on the African continent or businesses. So, and I don't just mean, French or Portuguese, but African languages. So I think we can all agree that language is a great connector. Even just a few words here and there can really help build a relationship. So I was just hoping to hear. And I know that DFAT has its own program, for heads of mission and embassies, consulates, what have you. But does Austrade have a separate trade-focused language strategy?
So I wouldn't say we have a separate strategy. We're obviously part of the portfolio that sits under the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and our staff can leverage some of their programs of work. We do very much recruit with language in mind in certain markets, that having particularly our Australian-based staff with the right skills to be able to engage into those. But I wouldn't say that we have a comprehensive strategy independent of the portfolio in the way that we do that. There are obviously some countries where, detailed language skills are a requirement, and there are some countries, and particularly within the African continent, where the balance between English as the business language and having some of that conversational capability does go a long way. Okay, and we probably recruit for that. The second part that's probably worth noting is why, and I mentioned again prior to you coming in here, is that the importance of locally engaged staff, that we employ people locally in country that obviously have those language skills, have the cultural knowledge that actually help us guide through that and help businesses to actually conclude deals.
And may I ask a follow-up, Chair? Do you think the current level of focus is sufficient, or do we need to have a greater emphasis on these skills?
I think more holistic for Austrade is that we have, language is very much clear in our strategy of our people being posted overseas. And we do certainly plug into the portfolio of Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. So I think it's sufficient in terms of we're clear that you need that. But we don't have a dedicated strategy, and that could strengthen some of the things that we do.
Okay. Thank you.
Senator Smith.
Thank you very much, and thank you for your time today. Is anyone in Austrade remunerated with an incentive? So is anyone in Austrade remunerated, or is part of their remuneration based on growing commercial outcomes in a certain area or in a certain sector?
We're remunerated as public servants or locally engaged staff, but not for performance of commercial deals.
Does Austrade operate with a goal in mind? So, for example, in your submission, you've identified that Austrade supported 13 commercial outcomes in African markets valued at $9.4 million, which is 0.1% of global outcomes. So, for example, is Austrade's Africa strategy to grow from 9.4 million to 20 million?
I'll hand to Mr Versby to give you a sense of our performance framework, which is where you're heading.
Yep.
Yeah, so in terms of the Africa, we have around 160 clients that get serviced there over that 12-month period on average. And then in terms of the
submission, is that the same as the 176 businesses that Austrade supported in African markets?
Correct, yeah,
Yep.
but on average it's around
In
that.
2024-25,
Yeah, so around that amount on average as well. And then in terms of the outcome framework, we have 4 outcomes. One is in terms of direct sales, in terms of growth that they'll achieve in a particular market. So we don't want our locally engaged staff to just get the first crate of oranges sold. We want them to work with that company to grow their exports further. So we encourage that in terms of our performance framework. The third main outcome is in relation to winning contracts and tenders, and that's particularly important for the METS companies, where we want them working on a pipeline of sales. They're the sort of key outcomes. There's also outward investment, which is probably less reflected in Africa in terms of those outcome numbers. And then obviously we keep a very close eye on student numbers as well, both from a transnational perspective into those campuses in Dubai and Mauritius, but also inbound to Australia, and how that performs.
Sorry, Senator, if I could just maybe bring it back to, whilst we're not remunerated financially, we very much have in every person's performance plans these performance targets that they have to drive towards delivering each year.
So in Austrade there is a league of superstars that drive trade outcomes, that drive trade growth, that drive sales. Is there like a league board that says,
I wouldn't say there's a league board, but there's a...
there are some people that have got very strong reputation for driving trade outcomes?
We keep a very active eye on how everyone's performing in terms of those metrics, but we set performance targets at a regional level. So Africa is part of the Middle East and Africa region, so they'll be set an outcome value target and an outcome volume target. It's not separated out by market. We allow that to the general manager of that region to determine how they drive that performance that we're looking for overall.
So outcome volume and outcome...
Value.
Yeah. Are you able to give us an indication perhaps over the last 4 years about whether or not in the African market those outcomes have been exceeded, fallen short?
So we can give it in the context of the Middle East and Africa, because that's how the region's set.
This is a very interesting point, because one of the representatives to our country made the observation that part of our failing is because we don't distinguish more obviously between the Middle East and Africa.
Yep.
And I just noticed that in regards to your submission as well, in regards to the location of the Trade Commissioner, something as simple as the job title of the General Manager International, Middle East and Africa, based in Dubai. The General Manager International, UK, Europe and Israel, doesn't even mention Africa, based in Morocco. I'm just wondering whether or not we're getting the optics of things laser focused, to steal your expression.
And maybe, Senator, I'd like to give it the context is that what you're reading, and that is the way that we've chosen to structurally frame our operating model. In other words, we have 8 regions all in the world around that. But what I would say is that you do have a Trade Commissioner sitting in Kenya that is very focused on trade and investment between Australia and obviously a sequence of locally engaged staff, and they have a clear approach and focus of the things that they're running at to do that. So whilst you may see our operational management and yes, senior roles over the top in other locations, we're outlining that we're rolling that, I suppose, in the context of the budget we have available to put people, we would love to have people everywhere, but that isn't a viable option for us at this point.
And then
But you
underneath
did make the earlier observation that it was important to have strategy first, then resourcing. How modern, how recent is Austrade's Africa strategy?
So it's probably worth just underneath the Trade Commissioner for Africa, there's the locally engaged staff. They'll be focused on sectors where the opportunities are, and then we'll be developing strategies that they're executing in those. So we've got education-focused staff in Africa. they will be putting in place engagement strategy with agents and with education providers from Australia to grow that opportunity. The same in the MET sector. We had out here in September last year our METS focused staff in WA at Africa Down Under, engaging with the sector around what the strategy is and where the opportunities are. So it gets very laser focused at the staff level, and that's how it's sort of operated, and that strategy is updated and reviewed on an annual basis by the team.
I just want to turn to the enablers of better familiarity and therefore trade. People are not going to trade necessarily with people they don't know. And this is one of the points that one of the representatives made to us last week. So what are the key enablers? Am I right to assume that reliable aviation links, for example, is a key enabler?
Yes.
And if so, how would we grade or how would we regard aviation links between Australia and Africa? And what are we doing to enable better aviation links? So what would some of the key enablers be?
So, I think you've hit. So, again, we probably touched on this at the very start, but modes of transport are key enablers to be able to make trade flow. And our shipping links and our airline links are limited. To generalise on the airline side is that we have flights in the bottom and we have flights from the top down coming in from the Middle East into Africa, which means obviously people movement and cargo movement through those flights is limited in terms of its ability then to be distributed across the African continent. From a shipping perspective, there obviously is bulk vessels that can be chartered in, and that certainly does happen around wheat exports and other products. But container shipments will typically run an African route up the course of the east coast of Africa as an example, which means the time for shipping is long. And it's a balance there about being realistic. It's a very long distances to be able to move these goods, and do we have enough demand beyond resources just to make that happen? So they're core enablers. I think the other key piece on enabling is actually understanding the opportunity, which is a theme coming through today, which Mr. Versby has talked about, our digital service offering and the Go Global Toolkit. How do you get Australian businesses to understand not just the word Africa, but actually Kenya and the agri opportunities that exist within that? And we are leveraging our relationship with the Australian African Chamber of Commerce, and we are leveraging our digital services to help get that knowledge up as an enabling piece.
So when we think about Southeast Asia, for example, we don't really think about Southeast Asia anymore. We think about Singapore, the Philippines, Indonesia. Is part of our challenge that we think about Africa, which lacks precision, which sort of suggests that you know it geographically, but you really don't know it with any level of intimacy because, 51, 54 nations, very, very different, quite remarkable in a way when you think about one continent with such variations.
Yeah, and I think that Australia is not necessarily unique in its reference to the word Africa versus actually 54 countries and what are the opportunities within those countries.
So we put that in context, I think, in terms of the Go Global Toolkit and demand of where companies are looking at. So Southeast Asia has in 24-25, 29,000 views to Africa, 1,680, and South Africa make up 311 of that, and then down to Morocco 180, Ghana 140. So the number of people that are viewing the content in Africa is something that we need to draw more people to those opportunities.
And instead of I go one step, I think it's about business leadership, and that's one of the things I talked about is we're going to bring a round table together of key bodies and business leaders to have a conversation about what are the opportunities in African countries. And it's a combination of government working with industry that actually leads to some of these opportunities being realised by developing a strategy that we think will work. And if we go back through history, for example, you will see Macquarie had representation in Africa looking at infrastructure projects. And so by bringing those business leaders to do some blue sky thinking and to have a conversation will help raise the profile and maybe change that narrative from Southeast Asia to Singapore to, Africa to Kenya.
Yeah, and it's also how we're working with peak bodies as part of the trade diversification network we mentioned earlier. If you take Osmine, they'll go to electromining in South Africa, but in the lead up to that, where we're partnering with them around creating opportunity guides around where are the business opportunities in mining in Africa, doing training for people before they actually go to that event around how do they prepare for it, what are the things that they need to consider differently from contracts to engagement. So we're looking at it in those sector opportunities, how do we partner with industry to get in front of the people that are essentially going to make the trade increase over the medium term.
Yeah.
To what extent is Austrade and its approach influenced by competitor threats or risks? So trade is an important way to build relationships and to build trust. Some of our strategic competitors and economic competitors use their trade and financial relationships effectively. They are big economies. To what extent does the presence of our competitors in a market encourage or influence our participation or withdrawal?
It's a very big question, Senator.
It's a very big issue.
Yeah.
And it's one of the things that we didn't really get an opportunity to speak to the representative from the Kingdom of Morocco. So on one level, fantastic and interesting story from Morocco. Scratch a little bit more deeply, and you can see some of the key drivers to that, might actually, be of interest to us beyond a trading relationship.
I think you'd have to go back to sort of first principles about what's our competitive advantage. That we're a natural exporting nation. As a nation, we have to export to be economically successful, and we do that through a number of industry sectors, whether it be resources, agriculture, and then applying it to where those opportunities align for business to succeed. I'm not sure I could comment about do we then use that tactically in every country in the world. What I do think is we have government looks at priority areas. And, I could give the example of Southeast Asia and the Moore report that was produced that has a very clear strategy to increase two-way trade. And actually this hearing today is to actually flesh out, are there opportunities to do more in Africa that might lead to a clear strategy that heads down the path that you're talking about, where we can take our competitive advantage and help position our exports into those markets or investment.
It is the 250th anniversary of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. I thought I would just sort of throw that in there just to add a little bit of sort of philosophical currency to the discussion. It is a big challenge as well as a big opportunity, though, isn't it?
Well, and I think, when we think about, globally about where the trade opportunities exist, then we've got to, for the purpose of this conversation today, we've got to weigh up where Africa fits within that, both now and over the horizon, and where do we want to position. And sort of similar to like any business is that we will need to invest into those opportunities that take time. And it could be 10 years, it could be 20 years before some of that realises. But there will be short-term things that we could realise quite quickly.
In that context, though, are we looking at this with the view of investing in those opportunities which will draw us into, or will build the relationships that draw us into a trading relationship over time?
And that's probably what and hopefully I'm getting some of this through today in my comments, is through the Accessing New Market Initiative. As we think about diversifying Australia's trade, it is actually about getting the right people in the room to talk about the opportunity that exists within the African continent to build that picture and to build that strategy and those relationships.
So looking at some other markets and the development of some other markets, and how we versus some of our trade competitors might have played. And I'm thinking of some in agriculture in particular, where to China, for example, New Zealand went in with a service offering first. Mm-hmm. They built relationships through that service offering to through various elements of the market. That service offering then became a trade product offering.
Correct.
Because of the way that they developed the markets and the way that they'd approached the development of the markets. Whereas we went in there trying to sell our products first up, which is why I'm looking at some of the service offering which develops those relationships that endure and then can be grown and developed into a stronger trade relationship because of the work that's been done in advance.
And Senator, maybe let me just bring that to life. You focused on agriculture. In China, the dairy industry has grown rapidly because of the service offering we've provided in helping them understand how to produce milk.
And I've had exactly those conversations in India just over a decade ago, and then talked to our industry here about it. But it's creating the understanding both in our industry and community that is what actually does drive that sequence is what actually drives the trade relationship. It does. In a rapidly developing economy.
And I would say, in a practical way, our resources sector has done that within Africa, is that we have ASX junior miners that are operating, we have METS companies that basically play a pivotal role in helping uplift capability in some of these countries, whether that's through their investment into schooling or whether that actually is industry development, that is a combination of services that lead to export along the way. It's how we think about that more holistically for other sectors within Africa is worth considering. Absolutely.
Yep. Might go to Mr. Lim.
Oh, thank you. We got many African students study in Australia, and then after they graduated, they went back to Africa. So do we have any stats that can they link both countries for us, or what sort of fellowship we got for them with us?
So I don't have those stats. We can take that on notice and see what we do have. But obviously, the alumni become powerful ambassadors for Australia when they go back to Africa. One of our locally engaged staff attended university in Australia and is now working for us, assisting Australian exporters expand into Africa. So it's in each of, and I'm sure DFAT touched on this at each of their posts, obviously they're engaging with the community as well that have those links to Australia to grow those links. Yeah.
Thank you.
Can I just ask a question about, I know Austrade operates an Australia Southeast Asia Business Exchange Program to increase two-way trade and a Southeast Asia investment deal teams to increase investment in the region. I'm just wondering if there's anything like that with Africa or any plans?
So not at this stage, and that's probably where I was going about bringing business and government together to have a roundtable conversation to start shaping that.
Yeah.
And what we have seen born out of Nicholas Moore's invested report on Southeast Asia is a very strong focus on which markets, what are the opportunities that we should be running at, and the resourcing from outward investment and two-way trade. Has helped that, and also the people-to-people links. So that doesn't exist, but we do have very clear sectoral focuses within Africa now. But I think that's the conversation about what are those opportunities and investigating that to bring something to life.
And it is part of the Accessing New Markets initiative that Mr Meek runs. The peak bodies in that, we've had the conversation around what markets they want to focus on or do work in. There's a few of them that have selected Africa to do work around understanding the opportunity that's there. And the met sector through Osmine are taking sort of an active program of assisting those companies into the market. So it's in the education side as well. We're working with those peak bodies to make sure that we're sort of connecting with industry around the strategy as well.
Great. Okay, we've only got a couple of minutes left. Are there any other last questions? No? Okay, so...
Can I just one final one?
Sure.
And I have had a pretty fair go. It was mentioned to us by some of the representatives from African nations last week about events like Africa Down Under. Mm-hmm. We hold those here. Has there been any approaches or conversations about doing something like that in those jurisdictions, or do they have any events? You've mentioned a couple that happen regionally, what was it?
So electromining
in the food,
Gulf food, well, that
Gulf food, for example. But are there any events where we might scoop up some Australian industry and representatives and take them to locations where we've identified opportunity?
Yeah, so we do, that's exactly what we do look at. And for example, that with the resources sector through this Accessing New Market initiative is that government will work with the peak body, Osmine, to take delegations in to an event into South Africa, which is a Pan-Africa event, to look at those opportunities. We do that day in, day out. And the key is to look at doing that both ways. Mm-hmm. I think the Australian Africa Chamber of Commerce has also looked at some larger scale events to bring people here to Australia and to do that overseas, and we'll have ongoing conversations with them.
So we touched on obviously electromining in the met sector, which is an event in South Africa that a delegation of businesses will go to. The other one in the education space for our Study Australia promotion. In recent years, we brought delegations to Africa. The most recent one had 15 institutions as part of that, and that was through Ghana and the West Africa region.
Thanks, Chair.
Okay, so thank you for your time today. If you have been asked to provide any additional information, including questions on notice, please forward it to the Secretariat by Wednesday, 8th of April 2026. Please note that responses to questions on notice will be published on the website as submissions to the inquiry. You will be sent a copy of the transcript of your evidence to assist with answering questions taken on notice today, and you will have an opportunity to request corrections to transcription errors. I would like to thank committee members and witnesses for their time today and declare the public hearing closed.
Thanks so much.